Engamana, engareo, engata wudapumanawa, ro, rakatidama, tanakoto, tenatato katoa. As most of you know, my name is Harlene Hain, and I have the great privilege of being the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Otago. And on behalf of the University, I would like to warmly welcome you to this inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Ruth Fitzgerald. As I look out on this audience, like many of the audiences we have for our IPLs, I see staff from around the university, I see students, I see members of the general Dunedin community who are such strong supporters of these inaugural professorial lectures and who, like many of you, use this as an opportunity for their ongoing education. I'd like to issue a very special welcome to Ruth's family and friends who are here with us this evening. Her partner, Dr. Martine Daru, her Toohey Street neighbors in St. Leonard's, who are my neighbors as well, her university friends Raywin Crump, Chris J., and Mike Legg, who is now retired from the University of Otago, but who drove here from the West Coast in order to be here. Mike, very welcome to you. And of course, all of Ruth's students who have taken time out of their busy day to come and join in this celebration. Now, as all of you in this room know, the rank of professor at the University of Otago is earned off the back of years of excellent teaching, research, and service to the university and the wider community. Those of you who know Professor Fitzgerald will know that she is a gifted teacher. She has given immense service to the university and to her professional community, and she is an outstanding researcher. Her work is both internationally recognized in the traditional academic sense, but it is also important, forcing us to engage with contemporary ethical issues in the area of biomedical science and practice. She has written on health policy, health practitioners, and people with disabilities. She is a pioneer in research into the human impact of biotechnologies and has contributed to the international debate on ethical issues related to biomedicine and genetics. Her work on morality and choice are central to contemporary science and society. I am sure, like me, everyone in the audience is very excited tonight about hearing more about her work and about her journey. So, Professor Fitzgerald, on behalf of the University of Otago, I would like to personally congratulate you on your very well-earned promotion to professor, and very shortly I will invite you to give your inaugural professorial lecture. But before you speak, I will first call on Professor Richard Walter, the head of Department of Archaeology and Anthropology, who is going to tell us just a little bit more about Ruth's academic journey to professor. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Tēnā koutou, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa I tēnei pō. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce my colleague Ruth Fitzgerald at this, her inaugural professorial lecture. Presenting an IPL is one of the great and most significant events in the careers of an academic, and one to be very proud of. But academia is a collective enterprise, and I'd like to signal here the pride we all have in the Department of Anthropology, seeing Ruth here tonight. Ruth's pathway has been a somewhat circuitous one. She was raised in Gympie, Queensland, an hour or so north of Brisbane, and attended the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, where she studied for a diploma in applied science, specialising in radiation therapy. This was the start of a long commitment to the health sciences that has become a core part of Ruth's teaching and research today. After her studies in Brisbane, Ruth moved to Sydney and started a new career in radio journalism. As part of her career development in that field, Ruth enrolled in a course on sound at the Sydney University of Technology. The Sydney University of Technology is a good Marxist university where the entry qualifications emphasise comradeship as much as grades. It was while she was in Sydney working in radio journalism that Ruth met her partner Martine, who is here somewhere. Oh, And it was Martine who encouraged Ruth to move here to Dunedin. In Dunedin, radio journalism was not going to be enough to keep the wolf from the door, so Ruth enrolled in a graduate degree in anthropology, where she undertook a PhD on the anthropology of care. That was in our department. Ruth has suggested to me that there was some element of chance in her choice of anthropology, but anyone who knows her work will understand what an excellent and logical choice that was. Throughout her previous studies and vocations, there are core interests around communication, experiences within the health sector, ethics of care, that social anthropology is perfectly served to support. After completing her PhD, Ruth began working with Hugh Campbell in the newly established CSAFE, and from there transitioned into a lecturing position in our department. Since taking on that position in 2001, Ruth has been an influential scholar and an inspirational teacher. Ruth was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute in 2009. She received the Te Rangihiroa Medal from the Royal Society of New Zealand in 2015 and has been the recipient of more teaching and supervisory awards than I can list, including the University of Otago Excellence in Teaching Award in 2017. I need say no more than to invite Ruth to come forward to present her lecture this evening. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this evening, and I just see, as in the life of many teachers, the assistant has set this up not the way I'd like it, but I'm just going to keep working with it, okay? I'm sure it'll work out in the end okay. As Richard said, I've been a long-term visitor here in Dunedin now for 20 years. It's wonderful to have been such a happy guest here, but my journey comes to you from Australia. I was born in the hinterland of the Sunshine Coast, and this is the traditional home of the Jinabari and the Kabi Kabi people. And as you look at this beautiful landscape, I'd just like to acknowledge their elders, past and present, and the safe haven that my family received there. We've lived in that area for about 130 years, and the pathways were from, I think, probably escaping the potato famine in Ireland through Birmingham and across, and also as refugees escaping civil war in Schleswig-Holstein. But my talk with you today concerns the research I've conducted here at Otago as a guest of Kaitahu. So I know, before I talk to you all, I should explain just a tiny bit about what anthropology really is and how we do research. So the sort of anthropology that I study is called cultural or social anthropology, and that's the study of people in all their contemporary diversity here in the current time. Now, one of the defining aspects of our work as social anthropologists is that we engage in field work, and we call that ethnography. That means we go and visit other people in their worlds to find out something of how they make meaning in their lives. Walcott has spoken about this as engaging in the 3 E's. Experiencing, where we're hanging out with people for long periods of time. Examining, where we explore archives and popular repositories of cultural information. That could be something as fleeting perhaps as graffiti. And inquiring, an extended continuum of communicating with people. It could be just everyday conversations over a long period of time, or it might be very formal interviews where we record our conversations and transcribe them and talk about them in depth. If we work in very small, short-term, well-defined little areas of research, then, and we're not related to sort of furthering anthropological knowledge in its broad sense, then we call our work borrowing ethnographic techniques. And my research covers both of those for them, and I study the cultural worldviews of biomedicine. Now, in its broadest sense, ethnography, in the words of Ruth Benedict, is an effort to make the world safe for human difference. And so anthropologists go to a very great length to practice this thing that we call cultural relativism. This is a perspective on societies that tries to explain and understand them from within the existing norms and rules of those particular societies. All of us, I think, in our research lives reach this point on a continuum of towards cultural relativism where we draw a line. But we're hoping as anthropologists we're going to travel a bit farther along that trajectory before we wobble off it. That, plus the sense that we're always trying to communicate with people to find out what the aesthetics and logics are of their own particular worldviews, that makes social anthropology a great set of tools to study contested and highly politicised aspects of life, and that's where all of my research has been to date. Other words we could apply to social anthropological methods are that they're serendipitous, they're qualitative, not always, they're slow, that's when the funders are asking us how things are going, and they're not representative of wider populations of people, so that's for all the statisticians in the audience, okay, I did my homework. They're rich and they're insightful and they're just wonderfully engaging if you like to read some of the work that we produce. So contemporary anthropologists work then from a variety of different subject positions, and we also always support this continuous process of decolonising our research methodologies. So the brief I was given today to talk with you tonight was to tell you a story about my research. And so I'm beginning with the PhD that I conducted here at Otago. Now, as luck would have it, that means I'm going to talk to you about restructuring, but for staff here, don't worry, it's not about a university. It's actually just about a hospital. It's close, but it's not too close, I'm hoping. So we have to go back in time then to the 1990s. And those of you that were here then, it was a really turbulent time for health reform. That was when we were experiencing the retreat of the welfare state in all these different areas of our lives as citizens, and it was quite disturbing. Very briefly, you might even remember the government tried to introduce fees for people who were being treated in our state hospital, but old age pensioners refused to pay those fees, and they dared the hospitals to take them to court. And in effect, they more or less shamed the government into retreating from that policy. They were very, very effective, so it only lasted for 3 months. Even so, there was still this overwhelming sense that money was drying up and services were being lost. And so patients in their wheelchairs and hospital beds were wheeled down the main street to protest these cuts to our healthcare funding. And I remember a particular Southland family who had lost, sadly, one of their own members while he was waiting to have stent surgery performed because he didn't have enough points on the waiting list as they were contriving the waiting list at that particular point. So he passed away, but his family got together and videoed themselves singing an incredibly rude song to the health minister of the time, Bill English. And remember Paul Holmes? Paul Holmes showed it, good on him, on the Current Affairs program. So in the midst of all this public agitation then about care, I was working in the oncology unit as a radiation therapist, and I was finding it all incredibly perplexing. One day the changes came to a head for me in a very personal way. I was treating a young woman with cancer who had a wound that needed constant dressing, and the wound needed to be covered with a special dressing that was non-stick, and it had a layer of charcoal within it. It made it a very expensive dressing to buy. Now, in the resource-rationed environment that we were working in at the time, I wasn't supposed to offer her any, and I knew, though, at that time a little of her circumstances, and I knew that she was really struggling to manage to keep herself feeling comfortable and clean over the weekends. She couldn't afford to buy all these dressings at the chemist. So I was treating her one afternoon on a Friday, and as I did so, I slipped across to our stock cupboards and began stuffing some of these bandages into a paper bag for her. And she smiled her thanks to me. At the same time, as luck would have it, I could hear the clip-clop of the stiletto heels of our manager walking around the corridor right into the treatment area where we were. So moving as though we were one, the woman and I lurched together and put our hands behind our back, and I passed the packages across into her waiting arms. While suspecting us mightily, that manager had enough human decency not to actually frisk us in the room. And so on that day at least, my patient successfully made off with her loot. At the moment, that time, that was when my PhD topic was really born to me. Because as I stood there with burning cheeks, really, because of this unvoiced reprimand from the manager, my mind travelled back to 15 years before, when I'd been training as a young cadet radiographer in Brisbane on a machine treating people with similar sorts of wounds that needed frequent dressing. And it was a Friday, I'd been daydreaming, and I'd forgotten to give one of the patients a big bag of bandages to last her over the weekend. The charge radiographer, I still remember her name and she frightens me still, Miss Pettigrew, discovered my oversight, and she picked up a bag of them and she threw them at me and said, "Go on after that patient, you've forgotten to give her those things, run after her and make sure she has some changes over the weekend." So off I went for a kilometre uphill in 40 degrees heat. I was actually fitter then. And I gave them to the lady. But it was really poignant to me because suddenly everything was clear. How could it be that in a time span of only 10 or so years, everything had changed so much that I was being reprimanded in the 1990s for doing what I had been reprimanded for forgetting to do in the 1980s? And so was I the only person who was noticing these sorts of changes? What did other people think about it? So I went on to conduct field work in these hospitals over a year or so, interviewing a variety of workers, both managerial and IT, and clinical workers as well, and always seeking out people who were well known for excellence in their sphere of endeavour. And my question that I was asking them seemed so very, very simple. What does care mean to you? As I conducted the fieldwork, I also took an interest in understanding clinical workers as much more broadly conceived as perhaps you might at first think them to be. So I included orderlies and receptionists, for example, as clinical labourers. All of these people I came to understand practiced wonderful clinical care to the very best of their abilities. You might wonder how it could be that people who aren't trained in biomedicine could become an expert carer. But many technical and service workers understood their jobs as a calling. And I vividly remember a time an electrician turning up to me in tears running down his face. And he had come to fix the X-ray warning lamp outside the room where I was working. And I said, "What happened to you?" And he said, "Oh, I've just been told I've been made redundant." And I said, "This is awful, just go home." He said, "Oh, no, I know these people have cancer. Their situation is much worse than mine. Of course, I'll stay, I'll fix the lamp." So as I started to understand it then, this was a characteristic of these sorts of workers. They understood their work as a calling. And as I started to talk to all this diverse group of people, I came to understand there was a characteristic demarcation in their responses to me, and this was the principal finding of the research, that the restructuring process in the hospitals had bifurcated the labour of care. Something that was once an ideal that all the workers held together uniformly had now been pressed apart into two different types of care. Type 1 care that I called relational or clinical care, and type 2 that I called abstracted or managerialist care. I'm going to talk about that one first. So each side of this division swore that the other side didn't care at all. But as I later understood, they both cared really intensely, but the object of their care was very, very different. Type 2 carers cared for the system, and type 1 carers cared for their patients. Understanding that the object of care can be very different for two people in the same situation is really important because it authorises completely different sets of practices and interventions as to what each person would imagine is the rational response to somebody needing or asking for care. As I said, abstraction was the identifying quality of these type 2 workers. And here behind me, you've got an example of one of these workers describing to you what it might be like to be an average, everyday sort of patient in the hospital. To look back at that time is to remember an internal working environment that was very, very tense. Even in the 1990s, there were many academic papers that explored the essential emotional turmoil that accompanies restructuring. And it would be fair to say in the hospital, the situation was equally grim for both sets of workers. Nobody was on top. For example, it was well known if you're an aspiring junior manager that at the very most, you had only 3 years before either you were promoted or you lost your job. The scrutiny these workers were under was incredibly intense, and there was this ferocious pressure for them to complete targets and to deliver new contracts, all the while maintaining an almost manic kind of can-do attitude in response to tasks hurled down to them from their own bosses, often presented publicly in bullying and humiliating manner. It also meant then that they worked so intensely, they often had to work through the night, and lots of times I would go along to conduct an interview with somebody only to find that they'd been up for 24 hours straight as they tried to make one of these impossibly tight deadlines. And they'd then been sent home to sleep because their other workers had noticed them wandering around and talking gibberish. They might have been avoiding the anthropologists, but I don't know. They had a very, very tough time of it. Now, the clinical workers also had a very difficult time, but they were pressured in very different ways. What happened for them was that time famines began to appear in their working lives as redundancies were made and their jobs were restructured and people were reallocated. This impacted on these clinical workers' capacity to provide the softer, healing-centred and individualised emotional responses that typified their various styles of care work. And this slide is showing you something of the orientation that these workers had to their positions. Now, the problem for these clinical staff was that when you looked at them in abstraction and stripped of context, and that was the appropriate way to view them if you were sitting as a high manager looking down on the workforce, when you did that, it seemed as though everybody was running around doing exactly the same thing. This was providing a set of technical cares with very high competency, and then the additional element of good customer service. When the managers understood it, healthcare in this way, it seemed to be a really good idea or a good omen. That seemed to then be possible to reduce the workforce, save some money by replacing segments of it with lesser trained assistants who would learn by heart how to do simpler procedures and then certainly just reproduce them, but they do it for lesser wages. But when you look in comparative context, as anthropologists always do, comparing one approach to the other side, you can see that the workers are doing something that's quite different, and it's very difficult to actually explain what it is. What was mistakenly understood by the type 2 carers, the managers, as good customer service was actually a type of emotional labour, something written about a decade earlier by Ali Hochschild. Very briefly, emotional labour is the manner in which we reach into ourselves to recall and to re-experience an authentic emotional tone or an ambience in new and somewhat inauthentic circumstances, for instance, when we're at work, perhaps. In its deepest sense, you can think of it as method acting. And emotional labour absolutely doesn't work unless it's performed absolutely convincingly, okay? And each of those performances costs us a great deal. But it is how excellent workers in the clinical situation avoid treating their patients merely as objects. And as I said before, it's the vehicle for healing and other meaning-centred interventions into people's lives. It's also a sense of great satisfaction, and workers often saw it as a reciprocal arrangement that they offered emotional labour, and then people responded with gratitude, and the workers had a sense that their work was meaningful. So I think of it as the element of artistry in care work, and it was produced out of the fabric of every single individual's life. It isn't easy in that case then to substitute one type of worker for another. They have different lives that they draw on. Nor can you substitute a junior worker for a more experienced one. And there was no amount of roster reorganising, the development of new care pathways, or any other such rationalisations of the workforce that was ever attempted that could incorporate this clinical care. And so the efficiencies that the managers were attempting to achieve constantly by reorganising and restructuring and reconfiguring, they were never achieved. This was because when the clinical workers were time pressured beyond endurance, they would retreat into providing only technical cares for their patients with no emotional context. This is like responding to that idea of primum non nocere, first do no harm. If I'm absolutely frazzled, I'll just make sure that I don't hurt you. Of course, this reduced rather than increased the superficial goal of customer satisfaction. Nobody likes to be in hospital and be treated just like a widget. As Nietzsche wrote in Aphorism 33 in The Gay Science, and I think this is really the nub of the problem, suppose that one assessed the value of a piece of music according to how much it could be counted, calculated, put into formulas. How absurd such a scientific assessment of music would be. What would one have comprehended, understood, or known about it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing of what is really music in it. And so sadly, although there was a lot that was potentially really similar between these different approaches to care, between the type 1 and the type 2 workers, the animosity between the groups was utterly insurmountable to understanding. Each group configured the other as the utter demon of its own universe, and neither group would recognise that, and in fact, it was both the system and the relational carers who needed to improve and enhance their caring styles. It was going to be several years, in fact, before the working environment became slightly normal again. But by that time, I had moved on, and I was working as a junior lecturer in the Anthropology department. So if there's anything that I learnt from my experience of my PhD, it was to recognise the complexity of this thing called emotional labour and the expression of good care. Every single worker whom I'd interviewed had shamefacedly told me how on certain days they had to fake an interest in their clients and how they had learnt to do this on their own without ever having had a single lecture on the topic in their working lives. All of them thought that they were the only person in the world to be doing such a thing, when in fact everybody that I spoke to had had to dig deep in their professional life in order to figure out how to manage this sort of emotional labour. So then I realised that emotional labour was never written into any job description, and its qualities varied with all the different professional occupations. There were different ways to go about engaging in it. So I was quite delighted then in 2004 to see some media debates in New Zealand about this new type of worker being brought to staff rural health clinics in remote areas of the South Island, the rural nurse specialists. There's a lot of hype in the media about whether or not these people were mini doctors or were they nurses, and also were they going to be any good. And I thought, gosh, I think I'm the only person in the world who's investigated caring styles. Maybe I could answer that question. So off I went to talk to them. The Nurses Professional Association, the Nursing Council, weighed in to this public debate and caused actually quite a lot of dismay for the nurses themselves by refusing to recognise the existing postgraduate qualifications that these workers had. And actually that was disturbing because a lot of them had paid out of their own pocket to study courses in internal medicine and emergency medicine in order to become more competent in their practice. But these weren't allowed to be counted. The New Zealand Medical Association also fanned the flames of this debate. I definitely remember a panic-stricken debate in our own med school about whether these nurses would have prescribing rights and would they be well enough educated to be able to prescribe safely. And of course that was reasonable to ask that question because rural areas have large populations of older people and the very young, and they're really difficult to prescribe for. And from the nurse's position, the stakes were also high. If they were performing the same tasks as junior doctors, and quite a lot of people said that they were, then they were doing so for very greatly reduced pay and for pretty dreadful working conditions. So into this maelstrom of competing discourses, I set out to ask these workers, are you doctoring or are you nursing in your practice? So after exploring beautiful scenic stretches like this all around the country, it was actually quite a nice research project in retrospect, I came away with the answer yes. Yes, the nurses still understood themselves to be nursing, but they were being pressured quite constantly towards adopting more doctoring styles, and they were resisting them as well as they could. And these quotes that you've got up here are showing you how some of them were being pressed to provide a sort of upfront and more commanding emotional labour that they weren't trained for or that they didn't particularly want to engage in. There was also problems in their technical cares too, where they were being pressed to take up different positions. And that was the art of conducting internal examinations. The need to prescribe. At the time that I did this study, that was managed through this kind of elaborate doctor-nurse charade conducted over the telephone, and also this reluctant capacity to diagnose. Now, the diagnosis skills came in because these nurses would often receive acute presentations of people quite significantly ill, and they would have to decide very, very quickly, is this illness coming from a medical position, in which case I'm going to have to get an ambulance and send them to a local hospital, or is it something that needs surgical treatment, in which case I have to airlift them in a helicopter to a regional hospital. And these nurses just stood at the crux of this dilemma. If they chose the helicopter and it was wrong, they used up 3 or 4 months of the healthcare service budget for their unit. And they felt very, very draftily exposed to personal censure over this diagnosis. And some of them said about their position that their professional status was actually only as good as their last diagnosis. So as the project wound to its close, I saw that the concept of care was actually very deeply political, but I also thought I was listening to people describing how to be a good person in the light of very rapidly changing expectations and duties. For instance, most of the people that I spoke to had arrived at nursing simply by accident. They happened to have been in a remote area, decided to live there, and then someone found out they were a nurse and asked them to staff the clinic. So they were acutely aware that if they refused to accept this burden of responsibility, there was likely to be nobody else who would come, because they were beautiful places, but they were very, very remote. So it was kind of a duty or an obligation of care that they were expressing. So I became interested then to go further into this area and to look at moral reasoning. So I've got a slide here just showing you a quote from a French theorist of practice, Pierre Bourdieu, and his work has been fundamental to me in understanding that link between caring, moral reasoning and personal identity. So time for a space. If you're in my 200 level class, I'd ask you a question now that you get 1% for. So I'm asking you, I think what I'd be asking you about is like, what is this thing that links then what I've been talking about caring with what I'm going to talk about moral reasoning? And for me, it's on this slide. It's the embodiment of that emotional labour and how you weave it into your identity. It's quite important. So by that stage, I met a good bloke in biochemistry, Associate Professor Mike Legg, and we started teaching and supervising together and became very interested in what we saw as this change in the nature of healthcare, in that a lot of biological scientists were learning to move forward and go into healthcare, and they were actually having to engage with clinical workers, with patients as well. And we wondered how were they doing when they tried to shift across to become healthcare workers. And we chose an area that we thought would be pretty relevant, and that was fertility laboratories, IVF labs. So we went off and interviewed a lot of workers in these different positions, and their work was absolutely fascinating to me because in these laboratories, good technical care is as close to perfection as it's possible to be. Workers would all tell me that while it might be possible to perhaps keep working in this area if you made one mistake, if you made two, you were unemployable. And furthermore, you wouldn't even think of trying to get another job. I was just struck with this flawless technique, and as it was part of their caring styles. But the workers themselves were completely uninterested in it. They just took it for granted. Although this excerpt that you're looking at here is showing you just how hard won that final confidence in their abilities really was. But the scientists instead were absolutely just gobsmacked by this idea of emotional labour. Finally, they'd say, after Mike and I had been travelling around the country talking to different groups of them, that's the reason for that feeling late at night when I lie awake and I worry about the fertility rate in our lab, and I've got to go and see Mrs. X tomorrow and talk to her about it. So at least that performed a small public service, we thought, for them. But drawing on to this other idea of moral reasoning, this is another thing that emerged as we were talking to these workers, and we found from our shared conversations that a lot of these workers had some ethical qualms about the sort of clinical work that they were engaging in. For the embryologists, it was experienced as these moments of compromise between what they understood and clearly dearly defended as the population's right to have a freedom of choice in reproductive matters, and what they felt was their own complicity because of their specific expertise in creating families they felt a little uncomfortable with. And this was, of course, despite all the work being completely, fully ethically approved in the labs. And also I just wanted to say that the workers themselves never revealed this to their patients. That was part of their emotional labour, to maintain this perfect composure, even if they had some internal misgivings. What those triggers might be for different workers varied. For example, it might be intergenerational donation of gametes within the one family to create a pregnancy. It might perhaps be same-sex couples. It was definitely deceitful heterosexual relationships. People were very upset when they sort of caught on to that. And occasionally just that very wealthy couple who was too cavalier in their request to dispose of embryos. Others just wondered quietly about whether or not children would be happy in the sorts of arrangements and partnerships they were looking at. Now, the scientists would get themselves quite worked up about this late at night and then sort of talk themselves back down again by saying to themselves things like, well, what I do is just basic biology. IVF is just the routine culling that happens any time in the ordinary reproductive cycle. I'm not playing God. And in addition, the clinics provided really well-run group ethical meetings where people could work out collectively their approach to very complex requirements or requests for certain types of IVF treatment. But even so, there was always this niggle of concern. One scientist spoke to me about it in this manner. There are boundaries, and then one boundary gets pushed, and then the next case you come across, it's like, well, we did that last week and that was case A. Well, case B this week is like that. It's just a little bit different. And things, though, they seem to just be sort of getting weirder and weirder as they go along. So while all scientists, in a positive sense, thought that they developed increased tolerances for a wide variety of family structures by doing this work, that had been achieved at some personal cost, and some of this was still unresolved. From this and our other work with cytogeneticists who create the reports about fetal genetic difference when you go off to have an amniocentesis. When you're pregnant, they're the scientists who create those results for you. We found they also had some niggling concerns about the implications of their work, which again, they didn't speak to anybody. Their concerns were that they felt the GPs they reported to didn't understand the sorts of results or their significance that they were giving them. But on that basis, Mike and I decided to investigate a little further. We were interested in how people were starting to talk quite a lot about prenatal genetic testing, and we wondered if we were hearing everybody's stories. It seemed as though perhaps we were not. Our concerns were shared by a good friend and colleague up at the north at the University of Auckland, Professor Emeritus Julie Park. And so we decided to combine our research projects together and add in a few new ones, and this was called the Troubling Choice Marsden Project. I've just laid it out here. I'll speak to this in just a moment. But our questions for this research were, how do people make decisions about reproduction and the significance of prenatal testing results in these pressured times, you know, when people had just given just only a few weeks to understand the significance of the results from these technologies, link that to the genetic makeup of the child that they're carrying, and then wonder how to be a good parent in these circumstances. And I think it's particularly poignant because for a lot of the sorts of genetic difference that were being diagnosed, the treatment available was often simply to consider termination. So the metabolic disorders, there were some treatments, but not for many others. So each box on this diagram then is a little group of people that we studied, even the little ones and the quite long ones, within our wider community. And as we interviewed these people, we were kind of interested to know, like, what sense are people making of these technologies? Some anthropologists have written about IVF, fertility treatment, as though it were a machine for managing hope. And PGD, the embryo biopsying techniques, where you decide whether or not to implant a particular embryo with a particular genetic makeup, they were seen as mechanisms for expressing grief because it was such an uncertain and difficult path to follow. So our thoughts about genetic testing in New Zealand, when it's combined with that background legislation that allows therapeutic terminations of pregnancies, was that the effect of the testing was to create cultural meanings of disability. And actually, this is what this diagram is trying to show you. So what we've done is sort of a bit like a scatter plot, maybe. We've put all these different people we've been talking to on this square, which is actually has two continuums running across it. So we've got the horizontal line of difference. On one side, we have medical models of disability. That's that sense that disability is an error or something that needs to be corrected or removed or fixed. Right across to the more social model of disability on your left-hand side. And this is when people think of disability as just everyday, ordinary human difference. We all have impairments at different points in our life. And in fact, it's society that's deeply disabling. And so we just placed all the people we're talking to about this idea of genetic testing on this continuum. Now, disability is just such a complex phenomenon, okay? There's many more ways to understand it. And Beetson has said, for instance, that it also forms part of our identity, and it's highly political. And one of the other continuums that we were interested in looking at was whether people, what they thought in private about it and what they were prepared to say in public about it. Remember those embryologists and the other scientists who sort of had these ideas, but they didn't voice them? So they're up the top. At the very top, the interviews I conducted with 60 women around the South Island who had conducted pregnancy terminations. And a lot of these interviews, I was actually the only other person this woman had spoken to in her entire life. So very private conversations, right down at the bottom, where people get on the computer and write out a great report or a set of lists and demands to the government and publish it on the web. So the point of that Marsden project and all that work was to find an empirically derived model of everyday ethics that was specific to New Zealand's cultural responses to the dilemma of prenatal genetic testing. This slide is showing you now some of the elements of this model that we've been working on, and we're still figuring it out, but some elements are still very clear, I think. For instance, a lot of studies about ethical reasoning around testing talk about this testing in the present tense, as though you gather a conversation from a few different people, you figure out what sort of moral reasoning styles they're doing, and that's the end of it. Now you know something about it. But all of our work has shown us that people's experience of selfhood, and thus decision-making, changes deeply in the context of their lives. Some families we spoke to, for instance, absolutely refused to consider a termination for their first child diagnosed with a genetic disorder, but considered it very carefully indeed for a second child because of the wish to provide higher level care for the firstborn. So they were sort of honouring that contract that they had set up initially with that first child. It wasn't that their views about right to life, perhaps, or right to choose had changed. They had to honour that initial contract. So we argued, after hearing a lot of stories like this, that this dichotomised thinking about right to life versus right to choose really fails to capture the sorts of ethical entanglements that emerged when you speak to people who have actually had to pass through these situations. Rather than a universal quality of ethical thinking, we think that these terms really reflect instead popular cultural values from the United States that transport rather poorly across into our New Zealand environment. We think it's fairer to suggest that while ideas of the right to choose are still held very dear by certain segments of the population in New Zealand, not by everybody, the notion is more about how people are expressing this shared dream of a culturally decent society. It's much less an accurate expression of people's decision-making around reproduction. We can then make sense of results that were otherwise really quite complicated to explain. How many people would come into interviews with us and say, I absolutely uphold women's rights to choose. I want you to remember that that's my position on this. And then recount in their own words that they didn't have very many choices at all. And in fact, what they did, whether they decided to terminate or not, was the only thing possible in the circumstances. And I've argued elsewhere that this sort of reasoning is more like operating a set of tactics than a choice. Now, in contrast, this is what most people would say, they had no choice at all. In contrast, there was just one group, I don't know if you've heard of them or not, Saving Downs. They're the group that have argued that genetic testing technologies, prenatal testing technologies, are a type of state-sponsored genocide against people with Down syndrome here in New Zealand. They appeared to be the only group that we worked with who actually were trying to exercise the right to choose. And I just need to say that they would never say that. They personally would align themselves more with the right to life. But as an analyst, just listening to them, I saw that they were always trying to exercise choice, the choice to continue with their pregnancies. That was when their fetuses had been identified with Down syndrome and in the face of very persistent pressure from a variety of medical practitioners to respond to that by having a termination. Now, these stories came to us not only from Saving Downs, but from lots of other people. But remember, a little bit of homework for you. Remember I said anthropology can't speak to populations, okay? So this is just the views from the medical specialists and GPs that these people had spoken to. There was this general pressure towards a very medicalised view of disability that it had to be removed. So we suggest then, like, a better way of understanding this sort of thinking is that New Zealanders are operating a type of cosmopolitan vernacular of the right to choose. That's an oxymoron that describes those situations where people are all striving collectively for this unified thing, the good, but the way in which they're measuring it is very, very different. So there's quite a lot of variety. And we've seen in our studies lots of different types of ethical reasoning. Ethics of care, when families try to look at everybody's situation within their family before deciding whether to terminate a pregnancy. Other families that go on to follow a sort of virtue ethic where they're trying to develop moral character and becoming a good parent in these situations. And then groups like Saving Downs that draw on rights discourses. Speaking even more broadly, internationally, we found too that there are different cultural locations that create different local vernaculars of what, why and how to care. The ethical reasoning styles that we uncovered in New Zealand are not, for instance, the same as in Iceland, where for a short period of time the government stopped funding prenatal testing of fetuses. In that Icelandic study, the population responded to this by using private laboratories in Reykjavik. And for the several years of their study, Gottfridsdottir and Andersen found that absolutely no children were born at all with Down syndrome in Iceland. People worked out an ethical situation on their own that didn't offer them a welcome. Nor do our results mimic what was found in Finland, where a study by Meskus shows that Finnish people in the same situation resorted to Facebook discussions with their intimate group of, I don't know anything about Facebook, but I'm sure there's some way you can make it. So it's fairly intimate. Okay, so don't rely on me on how to do this. But these people would talk with their intimate friends on Facebook and work out, display the diagnosis, get different opinions. People would put in their 2 cents worth and everybody would come to this collective decision within the group as to this is what you should do, and these people would adopt it, and they would allow themselves to be swayed from what they were originally going to do to take on this new style. Now, New Zealanders didn't work like this. They often kept their decision-making to themselves. And even when they were publicly aligned with the group that had a certain orientation towards prenatal testing, in their own families, they often worked completely in a different way, and that cognitive dissonance was not a problem for them. All right, well, you've been very good, and you've been listening to some hard and very tricky things about my research, so I want to give you a break now, okay? So now we're going to do some more light-hearted projects about borrowing ethnographic techniques. And one of these projects is with Professor Murray Thompson, and we explored Otago adolescents' views of oral health. Now, while the research assistants on this project laboured fairly mightily in various classrooms around the province to ask these secondary school students some serious questions about oral health, as I watched and I listened to the recordings, I was struck by how much whispering and note-taking was going on during these sessions. Their students kept muttering the topic was gay, gay, gay. Now, not understanding the term, I do understand it quite well, but not in this particular context. Good, you're still awake, that's good. I rather foolhardily asked my first year class at the time for its meaning. And I received a small avalanche of rather rude emails, the best of which is still burned into my brain. It's when an old fart like you keeps asking boring questions of young people like us about something as stupid as this. Now, the truth, of course, is always enlightening, okay, although a little bruising. But my class was very startled the next week for me to tell them about this answer and to give whoever that anonymous person was my very sincere thanks. Because, of course, we went on to publish a really nice paper about the gayness of oral health. And we were confident in the knowledge that we had achieved that holy grail of anthropology, the insider's view of the phenomenon from an unimpeachable source. I'll just tell you about one more project that I'm working on right now, which is the Undergraduate Friendship Project. And so this is a study of, it combines my interest in teaching ethnographic methods with the study of friendship. Friendship is a particular type of human relatedness that was seen once in opposition to kinship, but now is understood as something rather more similar. And the research project is actually a methods course, and it's an example of these more collaborative, group-focused styles of teaching and learning we're trying to promote in social anthropology to help our students develop that graduate attribute of teamwork and collaboration. Using my second-year students as honorary research assistants, I see some up there now, we set out every 2 years, and down the front, to conduct interviews with other students about the meaning of friendship. So about 40 interviews. We analyse them together, collectively, and I work as the group's principal investigator. I started it, to be honest, on a whim, and because I thought friendship might be something that students would engage with. But over the last 6 years, I'm absolutely just astounded at what a rich and fertile, complex topic it really is. And it relates beautifully to these other things I've studied all my life, like care, reciprocity, tactics, and finally attuned moral reasoning. So I've just got a couple of ideas for you as the teachers in the audience that you might like to know about. From this study, we regularly hear stories about students coming into varsity and switching their major to one that they're not interested in at all because they want to study with a friend. Also, we see them giving us accounts of coming into class, ready to participate in class, standing at the door, looking in and finding nobody that they know to sit with, and so they turn around and walk away. And a lot of stories from really lovely young people who are missing out on classes and assignments in order to look after a friend who has often some pretty significant mental health issues. So how can I, it's good, isn't it? It's used with permission, everybody. So how can I bundle all of this talking up this evening into something that's contemporary to our worlds? Well, I guess one of the take-home messages from my own journey of research has been that in engaging in care, we're placed in situations where we need to decide on the tactics that we're going to follow in these various, very complicated predicaments in which we find ourselves. Tactics are not the same thing as choices. They have less options. They're framed by the context of our lives. They're thrown together from what is at hand. They do have the advantage of being fluid and being able to be modified in an instant. Also, remember, people in different circumstances select different objects of care, and so our tactics vary greatly, to the extent that while a lot of us care deeply, we often do so at cross purposes to each other. Skillful carers will try to navigate these gulfs and find some modus vivendi where most of us can tolerate the conditions of our living as we try to prosper those elements of our lives that we care about most deeply. It seems to me that education is offering us today some of these dilemmas on how to behave well in defining the object of our care and looking for tactical responses as much as healthcare did in the 1990s. Very recently, for instance, all the academics in this room and across the nation participated in the latest PBRF round, which is an auditing exercise in which the government tries to measure in an abstracted manner the quality of the care that we attach to our research. And really foolish would any of us have been, or our institutions, to have not contributed to this assessment of the state of health of our system. It seems to be that you have to keep nourishing the system with more data so that we can release funding for these relational person-to-person aspects of our teaching and research, which we value so highly. The extracted views of such an audit, of course, necessitates obscuring these interpersonal, collaborative, and I think artistic elements of the processes of a functioning and engaged, productive university. So here are a few more names that I would have put on the PBRF system if it allowed me to have a co-authored portfolio. I want to thank all of the administrative assistants, and especially I'm remembering Claire Phipps, who was our departmental manager so long ago. I entered into the course in anthropology when we had year-long courses, and believe it or not, they let me in halfway through the year. So half the assessments had already gone, and they still let me join. And Claire just knew my name. She collected bits and pieces of the things she thought might be useful. She just handed them to me one day and said, "Oh, this might help you." So here her job description was administrator, and there you go, she was this wonderful teacher. I'd also like to thank our graphic artist, Les O'Neill. That beautiful artwork of the Marsden was his work, and of course, you're a successful grant writer. Thank you for that work. And Heather Sadler sitting there for doing all this diabolically complex IT networking that I always invent for my methods classes, and one of the students here is remembering how hard they are. Thank you. Those teaching awards, we're sharing them. I'd like to thank Simon Hu and Les O'Neill and the Central Library staff, Siobhan and Lisa, and also Trisha Robbins, for supporting our National Social Anthropology Journal sites. You've helped us publish hundreds of peer-reviewed articles for New Zealand and overseas academics, and I know for sure that some of them were written about in the PBRF round. And also, thank you, Paula Hasler, for finding those fantastic books for research, and Christy Patterson for finding all those films for teaching at short notice. And I really want to commend the both of them for perfection in emotional labour by never once telling me I was a silly duffer when I urgently wrote saying, "I really need this book, I need it now," and they'd write back and say, "Yeah, it's in the library." So I'd like to close my talk this evening with my formal acknowledgements to research participants, colleagues and funders. Thank you all also very much for your presence this evening and your kind attentiveness to this talk. It's been lovely.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Tony Valentine and I'm the PVC Humanities here at the university. It is with great pleasure that I'll deliver a vote of thanks to Professor Fitzgerald. She has delivered an excellent lecture, a lecture that has reflected on her own professional and academic pathway, the nature of anthropology as a discipline, and the centrality of care and caring in her work. Now, this evening she's explored caring in a number of its dimensions, and she has challenged us to enlarge our sense and understanding of what caring is, to understand its range, its complexity, and what she describes as its artistry. These are really important arguments for us in a society where caring is often undervalued, both in an economic and a social sense. At the same time, as we grapple with questions around the pay and working conditions of nurses and carers, and we discuss the extent of the state's support for, or lack of support for, respite care, investment advisors tout retirement homes and assisted living facilities as great places to invest. The divergence between those two meanings of investment one emotional or moral and the other monetary, couldn't be more clear. And it's against that cultural landscape that Ruth's lecture has encouraged us to expand our sense of the ecology of caring and to think more broadly and carefully about cultures of care. Her arguments have been anchored in Ruth's own ethnographic experience as an ethnographic researcher, but her prior knowledge and experience as a radiographer as well. And of course, as an ethnographic researcher, she has a very sharp eye for the human dynamics of how institutions and health systems operate. That Professor Fitzgerald has delivered a thoughtful and engaging lecture is not surprising. She is quite simply an outstanding teacher. She is held in extremely high regard by her students because she supports their learning as they grapple with some of the weighty cultural issues and analytical questions that she has laid out this evening. But Professor Fitzgerald is also a great teacher because she cares. She enacts an ethos of thoughtful and respectful care for her students and their intellectual development. And if you spend even a small amount of time with Ruth, you get a very strong sense of her deep commitment to teaching and learning and her tremendous generosity. So, Professor Fitzgerald, we have greatly appreciated your lecture and we have really enjoyed coming together to join in this celebration of your promotion. So could you please join me in thanking and congratulating Ruth? I have a gift to present to her, and after that I would encourage you all to join us in the staff club for a reception.